Good evening. To not alarm the people that speak mostly English, so I'm just going to say our speakers are going to be speaking English. I'm going to be saying a few introduction words also in Hebrew. אז ערב טוב, ברוכים הבאים למכון הדר. אתם נמצאים כאן בבית מדרש שלנו, ואתם מוזמנים גם לראות בכניסה וכל מיני מקומות פרסומים, וגם להתעניין אצל אחד מאנשי הצוות על שלל האירועים הנהדרים שקורים כאן באופן שגרתי. אולי אני אציין מחר בערב שיעור של הרב שרה לוי סטיבנסון על סיפורי סוף חיים באגדות חז"ל, וימי עיון ושיעורים באופן רגיל. זהו. הערב שאנחנו נמצאים בו היום, הוא קורה במסגרת שבוע התפוצות. שבוע התפוצות זה יוזמה של מנהלת עמי, המנהלת הלאומית לקשרי ישראלים והתפוצות, ומשרד התפוצות. אנחנו רוצים לומר גם ברוכות הבאות לנציגות כאן של המנהלת עמי ושל משרד התפוצות, נועם וגיל. נכון? ותודה רבה על התמיכה באירוע הזה. אני רוצה גם לומר שיש כאן משתתפים מתוכנית עמיתי הדר, ואני רוצה לומר לכם שזכיתם בהזדמנות נפלאה ומיוחדת לשמוע כאן שתי אנשים משמעותיים למכון הדר, משמעותיים בכלל במאה השנים האחרונות, בסיפור של העם היהודי בארצות הברית ובישראל. וזהו, ואני מקווה שכולנו ננצל את הזכות הזאת. I want to say this event is part of what we call שבוע התפוצות. It's supported by מנהלת עמי and the Ministry of Diaspora, כן. And we thank them for their support in this event. I'm going to allow Yedida Lubin, who is going to be facilitating this conversation. I'm going to give you the pleasure of introducing Rabbi Yitz and Blue. I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of us for coming here and sharing your Torah and your words and your thoughts with us. And thank you, Yedida, Yedida is a great friend of Machon Hadar, and thank you for holding this.
Welcome, everyone. Not on? Now it's on? Okay. Welcome, everyone. Good evening, Erev Tov. I'm really very excited to facilitate this discussion. Rav Yitz and Blue Greenberg don't really need an introduction, but I'll give a brief introduction. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg is the president of the Greenberg Institute for the Advancement of Jewish Life at Machon Hadar. He is a premier Jewish educator and thinker who has been involved in many important projects over the years in the United States and in Israel. His latest book is The Triumph of Life, a narrative theology of Judaism, and it's available for sale in the back for 100 shekel. Blue Greenberg paved the way for Orthodox Jewish feminists. She is an outspoken advocate for women's issues, and especially the plight of agunot. She helped found the International Beit Din, a religious court established in the United States to find systematic halachic methods to help resolve the aguna crisis. The Greenbergs made Aliyah in 2017 after visiting many, many times over the years. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and I went to a very, very small Jewish day school. And another formative part of my Jewish education was actually in NCSY. And I'm indebted to J.J. Greenberg, alav shalom, who really instilled in me a sense of Jewish pride and a sense of connection to young Jews all over the United States. I think that was something very special that I got out of informal Jewish education, which I hope we'll have a chance to talk about tonight. All over the Talmud, we have stories of sages that go back and forth between Eretz Yisrael and Bavel. One of the most famous is Rabbi Zera, who came from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. And there's many snippets of what happened with him. And his role, I think, a lot of times is explaining, bringing rulings from Bavel. Bavel was a huge center of Jewish learning, and he brought them to Israel. But when he came to Israel, actually we learned this in Daf Yomi a couple weeks ago, in Chulin Daf Yudchet Amud Bet, there's a story that he comes from Bavel and he takes on the customs of Eretz Yisrael. So maybe tonight we'll hear from Yitz and Blue their reflections on Jewish life in the United States and how that can be incorporated into our life here in Israel. So we'll start. Blue, can you share with us, please, a personal story of an educational moment that you had as a child or a parent that had stuck with you?
Well, I was going to give a little bit, a short history of Jewish education as it affected me. I was born in 1936, so you can do the. I can track Jewish education from a very early age, and I was born in Seattle, Washington, which was sort of a small-sized Jewish community. I went to a public school, kindergarten through 8th grade, because there was no day school, but there was Talmud Torah, and I want to say a few words about Talmud Torah. I was aware that the men's Mizrahi, rabbis from Israel, were coming from Palestine to many of the small-sized cities in the United States and building the Talmud Torah movement. And I was the beneficiary of their work. What I didn't know until actually today when I asked Gemini what's the history of the Talmud Torah in Seattle, that it was actually founded in 1894. I was surprised because I wondered why by the time I went to the Talmud Torah of Seattle, they had a nice 2-story brick building, and obviously it was built, you know, in the 1920s, not in the 1940s when I was a student at the Talmud Torah. And it later became the day school, the Seattle Day School. So I want to say a few things about my Talmud Torah education. Boys and girls studied together. In those days, parents didn't drive them to school, so we walked to Talmud Torah from where, sometimes half a mile or a mile. When my sister graduated the Talmud Torah, when she graduated elementary school in Seattle, there was no more Jewish education. There was no more Talmud Torah beyond the 8th grade. And so my parents decided it was time to move. Actually, I remember my sister was invited to her first party that was held on a Friday night, and that's what, I guess, pushed their decision to move. My father had 2 criteria that it had, giving up the Pacific Ocean, it had to be near a body of water on the East Coast, and it had to have a day school. So we went to a day school that had recently been built. Talmud Torah education was good enough. That was 2 hours every day in Talmud Torah, 2 hours Monday to Thursday and 4 hours on Sunday. Good enough so that we entered the day school classes appropriate to our grade level. That means we had enough Hebrew language and familiarity with the major texts. So that was an indebtedness to the day school movement, to the Talmud Torah movement. And that's, I don't know if that's true of Memphis, but many, many cities around the country began their formal Jewish education with building a Talmud Torah. My second Jewish education experience was that when I graduated Highlight, the day school, we lived in Far Rockaway, which was Queens, and my parents sent me to Central Yeshiva High School for Girls, which was part of the Yeshiva University school system. And I remember distinctively, I would take the Long Island Railroad at 7:19 every morning, and in order to get to school on time for the 9 o'clock opening of school. The 7:19 train along Long Island Railroad was also the same train that took the boys in my age group who were going to the boys' school of Yeshiva University. And I have this distinct recollection that I was traveling on a stomach full of oatmeal and milk and juice, whatever was my mother determined that a young woman should not be let out of the house without being fairly stocked on nutrients. And the boys, because they hadn't davened yet, they were going to daven when they got to school, had these little packages of sensen. I don't know if anybody here knows what sensen is. They were these tiny little packages, like maybe 2 by 1 inch, like a tea bag size package with these little tiny black licorice dots, and that was what they had for breakfast. And because they didn't daven. Now that was a very strong impression on me, that I didn't mind that I didn't daven. It was just not in a, I didn't mind, you know, that I didn't daven, but I became just casually aware of all the differences, the distinctions between boys and girls. It was my first, I guess, the first real awareness. And this is another memory I had, and when I'm going to tie it up with what I'm going to say at the end about the importance of parents and reaching parents who make the decision for their children's Jewish education. I don't think that has changed that much, but I used to, in addition to the 1 3/4 ride to school, going home I took a subway to the Green Line bus and then connected to another Green Line bus to get back, and that was also 1 hour and 45 minutes. I was 14 years old, and sometimes the bus number 1, Green Line, did not connect to bus number 2 at a very deserted spot in Queens, outside of Reese Park. So I can attest to the efficacy of Shema Yisrael, which if I missed one bus, I recited Shema Yisrael 1,000 times until the next bus showed up, and it worked. But I'm surprised that my mother and my father, who always worried about my safety, you know, really prioritized Jewish education. I don't think they were aware of the missed buses. I don't think I even told them about how scared I was of that, missing that other bus. But they accepted the arduous travel, you know, and that was the importance. It's funny how a small thing such as a 3-hour trip to school every day would enhance my understanding and appreciation of Jewish education. My next step was Yeshiva University, was Brooklyn College after high school, and Yeshiva University Teachers Institute for Women. And that was crucial for me because while I was at TI Women, there was a new program called Seminar L'Morim Michutz La'aretz. It was one of the first programs for teachers, or they had a similar program for camp counselors, and that was called Seminar L'Madrichim Michutz La'aretz. And that was the most formidable experience. No, formidable is not the word I'm looking for. What's the word I'm looking for? Formative or influential experience, because I had Nechama Leibowitz, Aleh Shalom, was my teacher, many other prominent teachers, but I had 3 experiences. And all of them, one of them was Nechama. And of a woman who was totally knowledgeable and well and versed in Talmud and all Jewish texts. I wanted to be her mesharetet. I mean, at the end of the year, I decided I wanted to stay another year, and Nechama was traveling all around the country in her sneakers and her little shopping bag, carrying her svarim, going to kibbutzim, and I was not only enamored, I was enamored of her and impressed by her, and I learned so much from her, and she was an extraordinary model, and I felt a second year in Israel would be just heaven for me. But my parents said no, and my cousin, who was the same age, was a year younger than I, had a similar experience. He didn't have Nechama, he had some Rebbes that he liked at his yeshiva, which was in Mea Shearim, and he wanted to stay a second year. And everyone fell all over him. And he did stay a second year, but I was a girl, and everyone said, not just my parents, everyone said, come home, that's not the thing. Nowadays, it's quite different, but that was an awareness that I later on contributed to my work in women's equality. My second experience was we had a wonderful tour guide, and we took a trip outside of Jerusalem, and we stood on two mountains, somewhere in the hills of Judea. And our guide said, you stand, he divided our group, which was 30 teachers in training. He said, you stand, half the group stand on this hill and half the group stand on the other hill. And then he said, this is where David stood, and this is where Goliath. A stone's throw, but you had to have a good throwing arm, a slingshot, right? And it was actually just a very thrilling moment for me. It was, I guess, the first visceral experience I had of connection to the land and the continuity of the Jewish people and our colonialism here. Sorry about that. Okay, what? I have my third experience. Right. Yes, our group was so new, our groups were so new that we met with David Ben-Gurion, and I had the privilege of presenting the group. And in the middle of my remarks, he interrupted me. Firstly, he said to me, what's your name? And I said, Blue Genauer. And he said, Blue, what kind of a name is that? He said, when you come on Aliyah, I'll give you a Hebrew name. Techelet. Unfortunately, whenever I meet a Techelet. But he also said something that I didn't agree with, which actually was what probably delayed my aliyah, our aliyah for many years, was I answered his question. He said, why don't you come on aliyah? And I said, family. He said, oh, family, bosh. You know, it's more important to make aliyah. But I didn't agree because family was very important to me. But I see that in the generations of our family, children make aliyah. We're still all family. We're all very connected. And it was just a reminder that my thoughts about Aliyah actually started in that conversation with David Ben-Gurion. Okay, I'll stop right here.
Thank you for those very personal reflections. Now we're going to take more of an overview. And Rabbi Yitz, would you take a few minutes to tell us the story of Jewish education in America over your lifetime as you see it? Pointing out 2 or 3 major moving or important transitions or changes.
Thank you very much. Blue will join me in exploring this, but let me start. I'll start with what I would say is good news and bad news. We're talking about the past half century of Jewish education in America. The good news was that this was the half century in which Jewish education was brought into the center of the Jewish communal agenda. In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the American Jewish community was, I would call it, the most important issue was to become American. It's pretty close to assimilation, although it wasn't always literally assimilation. And the Jews were the great proponents of public schools. Jews went to public schools. Jews were fighters for separation of church and state, so their kids in the public schools shouldn't feel that it's a Christian state, a country. And Jews were very much determined to become fully integrated in America. That changed, and Jewish education, which was an orphan and a sideline, became central during this period. But that's the bad news too, partly or mainly because in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the community discovered the soaring rates of intermarriage and assimilation. And particularly influential was the 1990 Jewish population survey that showed that intermarriage which was probably in the low, but not even double digits up to the 60s, by the 1990s, had reached 40, 50% on a national basis, although it was lower in New York and in the traditional or Orthodox Jewish communities. So that was a major factor, plus the African American migration to the north from the south, and they entered the public schools and brought many problems. The education in the south was poor, there were problems also of crime and so on. So that gave an extra push to parents, Jewish parents, willing to consider shifting their children from the public schools to the day schools. So that's the good news and bad news. Now, if I talk about trends, in this half century, the main trend and the most dramatic improvement and development, I would say, was in informal Jewish education. In three areas that really exploded in terms of underwriting, participation, numbers, and influence. One was camping, Jewish camping, led particularly by the Foundation for Jewish Camp and the Grinspoon Foundation J Camp Initiative, but it was beyond that. Jewish camping was seen as the opportunity to create a living Jewish community experience, learning, Shabbat, celebration, etc. Second major informal area was, of course, trips to Israel. Here again, there had been individual and communities, but it became a national thing. Perhaps the climax or the most influential development was, of course, Birthright Israel, and that was pioneered, pushed by Jewish Life Network Steinhardt Foundation. Our own son, J.J. Zichrono Livracha, was the chief staff developing Birthright Israel from an idea of a ticket to Jews between the age of 18 and 25 to go to Israel, to an educational 10-day trip in which, with a group and with a strong educational content. But Birthright Israel, the most prominent, at its peak, which was before the impact of the COVID and the war, it was reaching 40, 50,000 students a year. But the whole idea of using the trip to Israel, and again, the theory behind it was, we'll come back to that later in the evening, was that the exposure to Israel not only connected them to Israel, but the exposure to a living Jewish nation and state really turned them on to being Jewish in general. Studies afterwards showed, for example, that the Birthright Israel participants' priority to marry a Jewish spouse went from what was typical of teenagers, 30% to 50 to 70% in terms of just the impact of the experience. And again, as I said, it wasn't just Israel, the wall, well, they did go to the wall, or Masada, it was also the Tel Aviv nightclubs. And the reason is obvious, because never in their life had the typical Jew in diaspora seen Jewish and Jewish culture and Jewish life as central. It was in America, and you were marginal, even in the best places. And here it was central, and it worked, and the Jewish people, as other people, were dynamic and exciting. And of course, the Israeli IDF soldiers traveled with these groups and meeting Israelis and talking. That was also a major factor. Just a side comment, what I say about the impact of these trips. The first year or two, the Army didn't want to take, soldiers and separate them and have them travel for 10 days away from the Army. So we struggled really to get Jewish Israelis that could travel. And in fact, in the first year or two, was mostly high school seniors or the gap year program. However, we got the Army to give a few, and they came back and they were totally transformed. And they were heroes, and the Jewish diaspora students told them what an amazing job they're doing and how heroic they were. And the Army realized that this was the best brainwashing, this was the best way of really, so in fact, after the second year, the IDF chief of staff called us in and said, blank check, you can have as many suitors as you want, because the officers told them that this is better than any other training in terms of Jewish pride and sense of the Army's importance. Anyway, but the whole development of trips to Israel became Route 1, for example, the Marcus Foundation also funded thousands in Grinspoon and locals, whatever. So that was the second major area. The third major area of informal education was Jewish education for community leadership. In a sense, the community leadership in the 30s, 40s, 50s was assimilationist. But now the message was, if you're going to be a leader of the Jewish community, you have to be Jewish yourself, at least more knowledgeable. And so learning for leadership became much more expected and accepted. Federations, almost all of them adopted it. The pioneers here were Klal and Wexner and Hartman in time, and a bunch of additional such programs. So these were the three most widespread in formal education. Their numbers participating exploded. I should say a word about formal education. Formal education is a more mixed story. The most important development, and it should have been parallel to the other three, was day school. Up until the 50s, day school basically was a small, orthodox, kind of sectarian phenomenon. From the 60s on, there was a push and a surge toward day school education. People realizing that in an open society this was the great transformation of the 60s. Jews were accepted, Jews were welcome. And that, of course, explains the intermarriage rate. My wife, Blue, has made the point, very interesting comment, that if you study the Pew opinion research surveys, you will see that the attitude of the Christian parents toward Jews goes up in parallel with the rising intermarriage rate. In other words, when the Christian parents were antagonistic and looked down on Jews and threatened by it, intermarriage rates were lower. As they became more accepting and more affirmative of Jews, in fact, at some point, it became almost the opposite. A Jewish husband was a good catch. The rumor was that the Jewish husbands don't drink, and they earn a good salary, they bring it home, and they don't beat their wives. And be that as it may, so the day school education surged, and in particular in the 80s, 90s, led by the Partnership for Excellence in Jewish Education, the day schools spread beyond the Orthodox core to Solomon Schechter system, to community schools in many local places. Important development. The problem there is that it surged and then it hit a wall. Unlike the other three, it hit a wall, and I would say from the 2000 on, the numbers plateaued. And the problem that remained, not only the numbers plateaued, they couldn't get more students to go because it involves tuition and sacrifice. And the truth is that the committed parents were ready to do it, but there was just a limit on those parents. The other major formal Jewish education, so that it kind of plateaued, and it remains not only plateaued, but also, I would say, distorted in its age distribution. 80% of the day school movement registration is still in the elementary school, although we know that high school and college are the years when they are emotionally grow up and they become independent and they make life decisions. So ideally it would be the reverse, but that's the reality. And at the high school level, which is only 80% elementary, 20% high school, at the high school level, unfortunately, it remains 80% plus Orthodox, and only 20% or so of the non-Orthodox. The other major formal education that really developed enormously was Jewish studies. Jewish studies, which was in a handful of schools until the 60s, literally. Harvard had a chair going back to colonial times. Columbia had Jewish history, Sela Baram, one of the great Jewish historians, I don't think you had a million of schools with Jewish studies. Jewish studies exploded in the 60s along with ethnic studies, and it became a widespread phenomenon. That's, again, all that is kind of a good news. The only thing I would add to this, and that is, and that is that the other major development was the polarization. In other words, Blue described it, the centrality of the Talmud Torah in the earlier years. But in the 60s and on, you had a polarization. The parents, the 3 times a year Jews, used to send their kids to Talmud Torah. But Talmud Torah, not like Seattle, was typically 2 days a week or 3 days a week maximum and 6 hours maximum. But what happened basically was polarization. Those that cared deeply were prepared to invest and send kids to day schools. They went up. Those that didn't care didn't stop sending kids to Talmud Torah. So as the other forms grew, the Talmud Torah numbers shrank throughout this period. I think those are really the main trends during this period. And how does one summarize it? Well, the answer, honestly, is polarization. Meaning that at the end of this period and down to today, you have a stronger core of Jews in America. A good example of that, of course, is Hadar and its programs and its impact. Excuse me, but you also have a growing number of disaffiliated, not going to any synagogue, no connection whatsoever, and as I said before, soaring rates of intermarriage.
Thank you. Blue, did you have anything to add about the general state of Jewish education?
She also wants to talk about the Jewish rabbinic learning.
Yeah,
Women.
but
Oh.
it's a different question. No,
Oh.
no, I think that he
No.
covered the waterfront.
Okay.
Not,
No, I won't talk about it.
So we're going to move on to some specific issues in Jewish education. Blue, would you address feminism and its role in Jewish education and Jewish identity?
So So first I'll start with an experience that I had that opened up my eyes to the impact of feminism on Jewish identity. In 1973, the first international conference on Jewish women, no, the first, I think it was national, I can't remember now, my international conferences, the first, whatever, either national or international, my mind goes through this, I think that I'm confusing. JOFA was the International Women's Conference, and the New York conference was the first National Jewish Women's Conference, right? 1973. And there was a handful of Jewish women there, maybe Orthodox women, maybe 40 or 50, if that many. This was a conference of 500 women. 500 women and one man, I should say. The one man was sitting right here. We didn't know about feminist conferences, so we were invited to a conference. He was invited to speak on Sunday, and we parked our 5 children with friends in Riverdale, and 20 minutes before Shabbat, we arrived at the McAlpin Hotel, where the first National Jewish Conference for Women was held. And there we were for the whole Shabbat, 500 women and one man who sat behind the mechitza the whole time. The major force of that conference, which was planned by a group of women, including Federation women, a few Orthodox women as well, planned the conference. The major part of that conference was women who had really not had much of a Jewish identity. Now that was so surprising to me. I learned that feminism was a way into Judaism for a lot of women. I still am not 100% sure how that worked or works, but I've observed that a number of times since 1973, that women who were disaffected, I can't even say, or disinterested in Judaism, something about understanding who they were as women, or a deeper understanding of their roles and potential as women, also decided to go one step further and try to discover their roots and their roles as Jews. And that was an experience that was repeated throughout the next, I don't know if it's still true, because I think a lot has happened since 1973, and women are already there in their Judaism, or their feminists are there, or else they've left because they don't find a comfortable place. But this was a phenomenon, I would say, for 25 years of women coming to Judaism through feminism. And that was different for every other social movement. Socialists left Judaism, communists left Judaism, etc. Okay, that's number one. The second thing is that feminism has had a great impact on Judaism in a variety of different ways, particularly in understanding the roles of tradition, the roles and performances, and the place of women in Judaism, and the learning. So, I mentioned in my own formative experiences in day school and in study in Israel, there were a few instances where women were separated in terms of learning. We took this for granted. For example, my year in Israel, the men studied Talmud, the boys, as they were, studied Talmud, and the girls, I don't remember what we had. It was either dinim, law, or some other less sacred text than Talmud. In the last few decades, that has changed dramatically. Women, aside from the Daf Yomi now, that is very popular for Daf Yomi for women. I just can't resist telling this anecdote about my daughter, our daughter. Her youngest child, number 5, was stationed in Lebanon. This is about a year ago this happened. And he called her on a Friday morning and said that he's hungry. So she packed up food and drove 2.5 hours from Ra'anana to the border. He was in Lebanon. He got permission to come back to his base camp. She spent a half hour with him, gave him enough food to fill his stomach for a week, and then she turned around and went back. When she got into the car, I said, "Oh, Goody, why couldn't you get someone else to get some food to him? There must be restaurants up there, take-home places." If the army, she said, "Are you kidding?" I said, "You have to drive 5 hours to spend a half hour with your son, your soldier son," which actually now I'm embarrassed to say that I asked that question now that I think about it. But anyhow, she said, "Ima, are you kidding?" She said, 5 hours to myself, 2.5 hours going home, nobody to bother me. I can do Daf Yomi without interruption. My ancestors would just not believe that scenario. So that has been a major breakthrough of women's study of Talmud and other rabbinic texts, and in general, and women's rabbinic leadership. I have to say, a tribute to the Reform movement and to the conservative movement, who led the way in women's leadership in religious roles. But I think that not that it's important to see who gets credit for being there first, but just as a historical fact, the emphasis on Jewish education in Orthodoxy is Yitz expressed, I think is what prompted the expansion of Torah learning, Talmud learning within Orthodoxy. And we have here our good friend Steve, who's very influential in promoting women's learning and study of Judaism. Thanks.
So allow me to interrupt here for a second. With Blue's usual modesty, she sort of pass through this point. Number one is there has been, and well, first, let me go back, in fact, to a slightly earlier comment first. I was that one man, as I said, attending the women's conference, and she gave this opening talk, a keynote talk, and then it was a fascinating experience because the first half, she had worked on this, and she gave a critique of the tradition. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of areas where the tradition needs correction and improvement. So the first half of the talk was almost like a standing ovation. Every couple of minutes, they laughed and they applauded. And of course, she pointed out, and again, this is part of her integrity and honesty, that there's room in the tradition for, or needed room for improvement. In the second half of the talk, she then said, well, now that I've analyzed the tradition from a feminist perspective, allow me to analyze feminism from a tradition's perspective, and proceeded to give a critique of many of the excesses which today are taken for granted, that they were conceiving of equality as total identicality rather than as equal access and equal opportunity, that one could go on, that they devalued, they said women should be paid for home, for housework, because otherwise if you don't get paid, it has no value. And of course, Blue's main point was that Gemilut Chasadim and the great volunteer tradition of the Jewish people is not measured by money, paying for it. Anyway, so the first half was a standing ovation, the second half was groans and murmurs and undercurrent of anger. But I felt this is what launched her really in many ways, and that ability of integrity to see things as they are and not back down. And there's on the one hand to tell the tradition and to say I'm Orthodox and I'm not going to break the halakha, but I believe it can and should be changed in these ways and in that way, and here's where it falls short. And we love it enough, we get so much from it that we want to upgrade it. And on the other hand, as I said, at the same time, a willingness not to simply be a trendy, but to say, these are the good forces and good judgments and good values in feminism, and these are here where it's become distorted or exaggerated or one-sided. So that's now the application of what I said of modesty. In the Orthodox Jewish world, her making the case that women should be open to and are entitled to equal access to rabbinic tradition has really led to an explosion of women learning advanced rabbinic learning. Of course, it eventually ended up in rabbis here again, which she predicted. That's one of my favorite stories, which is in her first time she wrote, in 1982, she went through all the halachic issues and said, there's no halachic obstacle to Orthodox women becoming rabbis. Rather, it's a matter of custom and of attitude to community. And therefore, she predicted, this was the last paragraph, I predict that in my lifetime, there will be Orthodox women rabbis. We share each other's writings and we'll read them in advance. I'm reading this piece and loving it. And then I get to the last paragraph. In my lifetime, this is 1982, no one believed it. I run up the stairs, her office is in the second floor. I hug her, I say, do you realize what you just wrote? She says, what? I said, we're going to live forever. Anyway, the good news is that we're not going to live forever. And there are, in fact, women Orthodox rabbis as we speak, and a very important enrichment. But the idea behind it, that women, I would say probably really 90% of the educated, learned, rabbinically advanced women scholars of Jewish history are alive at this moment as we talk. I mean, it's an amazing transformation, because the truth is, in much of history, Jewish women had no education, period, let alone an education in rabbinic stuff. So you allow me to toot my own wife's horn, but I confess, full disclosure, I confess my bias, but it's true. It's an understatement of what I just said.
Thank you. Rav Yitz, could you briefly address Zionism and its role in Jewish education?
I'll give a very short answer there, too. Zionism, of course, is central to Judaism. And, the davening every day, going back, we were just at a wedding yesterday, Emesh Kachei Yerushalayim, right at the climax of the wedding and so on. So Zionism is central, and it is taught in teaching the tradition, but I would say that was the main vehicle of teaching. Perhaps some, and not much, of literally Zionist education, meaning contemporary Israel and the whole development of the Zionist movement, not until really the 90s and 2000s did you get formal courses and developments, and also, to be fair, or at least express the students' complaints. Some of the students complained afterward that the presentations of Israel were all ideal and perfect and did not really deal with any of the subtlety or complications, and therefore they were vulnerable when they got to campus or other places and of course some of the, I think, went off the tracks and ended up negative. They would play this up. You see, they sold this propaganda. So Zionism now, so again, this becomes one of the major challenges right now as we speak American Jewish education. Of course, none of us, I include myself, anticipated the tremendous shift or fall in support, respect, admiration for women, particularly in democratic and independent circles, partly because President Trump has been so strongly supportive of Israel. And again, instead of saying, well, a man is right on this issue but wrong on other issues, the attitude has been, if he's for it, then we're against it, kind of thing. So it is a major challenge going forward now. They're trying much more to put in more conscious courses on Zionism and Israel. We'll see what happens.
Blue, if you had the power to choose 3 texts that would be included in the curriculum for every American Jewish high school student, what would they be?
That was a very hard. 3 texts. Well, I would pick, first of all, I want to pick a text that had tremendous influence on me, and I think on probably the majority of Jews of my generation. It's not working. I turn it on, but then it goes right off. Use a battery or a pouch. Thank you. Thanks. Oh, this one, okay, good. I've met, I would say hundreds of people over the course of several decades who say the most influential book on their Zionist feelings was The Source by James Michener. And I learned only at a JPPI conference about maybe 10 years ago that actually it was Ben Gurion who not solicited, but who engineered that book. He put out, after the Declaration of Independence, he said, now we have to sell this idea to the various populations, and we need a good book. So it later became a movie, I think, but at any rate, that's how a lot of Jewish authors decided not to take up that challenge, but James Michener did. And how many of you have read The Source?
Leon Uris and Exodus.
Oh, I'm sorry, Leon Uris. No, I'm talking about I'm talking about Leon Uris or wait, Exodus, right? Exodus. That was the book that Ben Gurion. Yeah. Okay, and that was a book, right? That it's one of the few books that I read nonstop. It took me 2 days and 2
Soviet
nights.
Jews, when they discovered they're Jewish, I mean, it's...
That's right. Okay, so Ben Gurion was the one who solicited that book and contracted the author. So it still has that staying power. That's number 1. Number 2 is,
The text.
oh no, we're not talking about the text, we're talking about books first.
No, yes, the text.
No, what? Oh. I thought you wanted the books that are, okay. Okay,
You started to say, but
yeah, okay, I'll give my text.
influential text, but you didn't.
I thought it was influential books. Did I see somewhere in this assignment to choose books?
It was open-ended.
Open-ended, okay. My 3 favorite texts. This was very difficult, probably more difficult than picking a book, and I'll tell you why. So for one text, I picked the verse in Vayikra, Leviticus 19:16, which is just an amazing law, and it's in it's Lo Tamod Al Dam Reacha, which is, I call it the law of the bystander.
Yeah.
Do not stand idly by the blood of your brother. I haven't done a comparative survey of other religions, but I should. Before I say anything else, I will. Okay, thank you. I think it's so amazing that we have that law in our Torah. It's actually coupled with in the same verse, a very important law against slander and gossip. But the bystander law really affects human life, and we know from the Shoah, and it always cites the statistics, where the country was filled with bystanders, the country in which the Jews were living were filled with bystanders who didn't rise to aid Jews, who watched what was going on, and stood silently. That's where 90% of the Jewish population or more were lost, and where the country had people who observed this law: do not be a bystander, but if you see evil, if you see danger, if you see something that must be corrected, then the Jews were saved in those countries. I don't have the exact statistics, but it's a reversal of statistics, so that's one. The second verse is something that I'm wrestling with now. It's not my favorite verse, but I want to understand it. And that is from Breshit 3:16. And it comes after the whole, it's the curse that's put on Adam and Chava, or the prediction of, and the punishment for eating the apple, disobeying God. And part of it is about the relationship between husband and wife. And in this particular verse, it says, V'hu yimshol, and he shall rule, he, the husband, shall rule over you. That's the curse put on Chava, who represents women. So I have been working on this, the Aguna issue, and for several decades, and I've come to understand that there are sources, and more sources on eliminating the scourge of a man having the ability to withhold a get, really to persecute a wife by not releasing her from an unwanted marriage. And it's always baffling to me why rabbis who sees an opportunity to make life more relevant and easier by reinterpreting an ancient law and finding sources that will support a more lenient interpretation, or outlaw something that is too binding or too divisive. Why the rabbis have not risen to the opportunity by using these sources, which run throughout the tradition, to change the law on igun. In other words, why they are persisting. And I've come to the conclusion that it's a mindset, and mindset comes from this verse, V'hu yimshol, and he will rule over you. I never connected the two in all the years that I've been looking at this problem, but it's the only thing I can think of, and therefore I think it's not my favorite verse, and I think we need to have a lot of reinterpretation of that verse.
The irony there, of course, is that the verse is a curse, right? In other words, it's literally a curse. So, but as Blue is pointing out, it's not being handled as a curse to be undone. It's being handled as a kind of a guideline to justify male supremacy. Yeah, sorry.
Good. And the third thing is, I have to say, in a way, that question was unfair, in the sense selecting, not unfair, but difficult. And I decided just to speak the truth about my third choice, which comes out of the experience I've had in the last 6 years of participating in an outdoor minyan as a result of COVID. It's called Minyan Mirpasot because that was the first opportunity, was from our terraces. We could have a minyan. You could hear the Torah reading, Rishon down the block and Sheni up to the left. And so it was very charming. And then we moved outside and actually renamed the Minyan Chatzerot. First it went to the street and then it went to someone's courtyard. Sitting outside and reading the Torah and looking at the trees and the stone and looking at the sky and seeing, who planted the trees, seeing the generations. We actually live in a neighborhood of Arab houses, and much of the building of that neighborhood, Katamon, was done by Arabs, actually Christian Arabs who lived in that neighborhood. These were their summer homes. But I've experienced both the davening and the Torah differently, and I have to say that every week, it's sort of promiscuous almost. I say, oh, this is my favorite parsha. It happens all the time. Every single parsha in the Torah is my favorite parsha, the one that we're reading that week. So that's my third choice. Maybe it's my first choice. And I have to say I've come to a new appreciation of the tefillah, of the established tefillah, Shabbat tefillah. I see something new in it every week. And it is quite amazing to me that this is the work of our rabbis that was given to us as an enormous gift that we treasure.
Thank you. Rabbi Yitz, did you pick 3 texts?
Well, yeah, I did. Well, excuse me. My first text, universal, is Tzelem Elokim, that the Bible creation story climaxes with Vayivra Elokim Adam b'Tzelmo. God created a human being in God's image. In God's image, God created him, man and woman, God created them. And in particular, the Mishnah in Sanhedrin 37a, I put that verse with the Mishnah, which the witnesses in a capital punishment case were first had to learn what does it mean to say that human beings are images of God. So understand the weight and the importance, and before they could give testimony in a capital case. My argument is that the Mishnah tells us that every human being created in the image of God is born with 3 intrinsic dignities: infinite value beyond any amount of money their life is worth, B, equality, and C, uniqueness. So that text is one. The second text is covenant text. Again, there are many important covenant texts, but the best introduction, I think, is the covenant with Noah, the Brit Noach, because it involves one of the greatest shifts in the history of religion, and certainly in Jewish religion. It ends up being the characteristic, unique quality of Judaism, that it's not just God and worship of God, it's the partnership idea, that God self-limits not to do everything for us, not to just simply command, but to make a partnership to correct the world. That covenant process means that God unlike before the flood, God demands perfection, wants a perfect world, and when humans sin, God literally wipes them out, wipes out the world. After the flood, God pledges never to do that again, that natural law will operate, and that life will go on under normal circumstances by natural law, and instead God accepts human limitations and accepts the idea of working with humans to improve them and accepting their flaws and working with them to make a better world. So that second text is covenant, because I think as a religion, Judaism has this amazing combination of idealism, the messianic vision of a triumph of life, the messianic vision of perfecting the world, preparing the world to perfect, overcoming poverty and hunger and suffering, oppression, discrimination, sickness. That's part of our dream. But unlike the other ideological revolutionary movements of the 20th century, it controls this vision with the idea of covenant, one step at a time, incrementally, in partnership, no coercion, no violence, no force. So that's my second text. My third text, I will be arrogant and say, is not a classic text. I have in my book what I call a map or a kind of a calendar of the Jewish history, the three stages, biblical, rabbinic, and what I believe we're living through now, the third stage is lay. And I do think I'd like to see every Jew sort of face this, because it offers a narrative and explains where we are right now, because in my understanding, we are, God in the biblical, very domineering, very controlling, very gives orders, punishes and rewards. In the second phase of the rabbis, God self-limits, and humans, Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law, the rabbinic interpretation, becomes equally a source of revelation. So humans become much more active and much more responsible. I think in the third stage, God is close and participates in our lives, but humans take on the full responsibility by God's will for what happens, for good and for bad. And I think that's important for Jews who are alive today to understand that we're living in one of the great ages of transformation of Jewish history, and in which we have, as human beings, full responsibility. So that would be my third text.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're going to need to wrap up. So just as a final question and closing remarks, could you maybe speak a little bit about the future relationship between Israel and American Judaism, and give a final remark?
Well, I was hoping to I guess I talked too long. I was hoping to get some questions from the audience, but...
Oh, we have time. We have a little bit of time for
I would
that.
say on one foot, the future. Basically, in my judgment, we're one people, even though 50% or slightly more than 50% living outside of Israel. One people, and I believe the connection simply is that we strengthen each other. That was the theory behind Birthright Israel we worked on when we developed that. And the research shows it works. In other words, the inspirational power of the life of Israel, the living example, the reality that there's a Jewish society that works, inspires people in diaspora who don't make Aliyah to live more Jewish lives, to identify as Jews more. And to me, it's in a major crisis right now with the bad media and bad publicity and the bad attitude generated by the extremist ministers like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, and frankly, the failures or the limitations of Netanyahu. I'm worrying that this will have an effect not only in support of Israel, but in a loss of pride and commitment to live as Jews in diaspora. But that's the risk. We're living in a free society. As I say, I believe also that this is the age when humans take full responsibility. The bitter news is when we have full responsibility, so if we mess it up, we can really mess it up badly. And I'm more anxious now than I used to be about the future of democracy in Israel, but I'll take my position nevertheless. Given Jewish history up to now, my answer is I think Jewish people will come through. I think the majority of Israel, therefore, in the end, will protect and uphold democracy as fully as they uphold and protect the Jewishness of the State of Israel. And therefore, I predict, famous last words, I predict that in Israel will become again a major source of strengthening, study in Israel, life experience in Israel, even for diaspora, and vice versa. The truth is that Israel's acceptance, support, and importance in diaspora was in no small measure because the American or the Australian or the European Jewish communities were so committed to Israel and sold it and explained it and defended it politically and otherwise in their country. So I see the future as being the key for a vital Jewish future is that this restore and strengthen the relationship between the two and their influence upon each other. The stronger American Jewish life will be, the more it will treasure and protect Israel. The stronger, more influential, more positive Israel is, the stronger will be American Jewish life.
That was pretty comprehensive. That was,
Do you want to have some last words?
no, it's fine.
No. So, should we take? Are there questions from the audience?
I have a question for Blue Greenberg. I actually wanted to ask a question regarding what you think of the Flatbush Girl campaign to free Agunot. If you've been following what's going on, how do you feel about it? Is it really the landmark that it seems? I've been following the coverage pretty intently, and yeah, really looking forward to hear your thoughts.
Is it really, what was the second part of your question? Is it really what?
Is it really sort of a landmark of an Orthodox feminism? I think it's the biggest thing that happened to Orthodox feminism in probably the 21st century, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I guess I can explain it. Sure. It's a campaign by it's an Orthodox woman, Adina, I forgot her last name right now. She runs this very prolific Instagram page, and she's running a campaign for Agunot. Part of what it entails is broadly from women, like posting, sometimes uncovering parts of their body and sharing like their stories of how they became Agunot or how they support Agunot. And she's sharing this material in order to hopefully free one specific Aguna who has not yet been given a get. And she's posting a lot of additional research into the issue, and that's what's been happening for, I think, a couple of months at this point.
Probably a year already. She's been very active, but yeah. So I think it's certainly of great value, great bringing the problem to the attention of the whole community. Part of the complexity is that it also brings a bad reputation to Judaism and halakha, but we're sort of moving past that fear of washing our dirty laundry in public, because it hasn't really sunk Judaism altogether in the universe of religions. But we are the International Beit Din, which was formed to solve the problem through halakha, has taken a different tack. And so this is auxiliary, which is bringing attention to the problem, in a way that a court of law cannot do. But our you might say the sort of complementary efforts. The Beit Din has focused on halachic solutions, and it has and many more agunot are coming to the Beit Din now. And we can say perhaps it's because of Adina's work and telling them, that they don't have to be prisoners, and it's not right, and it's not halachic either. The Beit Din has now 14 years, 13 years of work in this field, and one of the problems is the same problem that the Flatbush girl faces, which is that it hasn't really caught on widely in other Batei Din around the world, including Israel. So we're hoping, we mean the International Beit Din, or we are hoping that we can have greater influence on the courts, and that every locale with major Jewish population or even a minor Jewish population shouldn't have to travel, or a Beit Din that's thousands of miles away or hundreds of miles away, but every Beit Din should be using these solutions. So I can say that bringing attention to the problem and putting pressure on, I think, is good. It hasn't actually had the same effect. It hasn't had the effect that the International Beit Din has wanted either, but maybe pulling together will have some results.
We have time for one more question. I can't choose. I could choose one.
Or you could take two and be very brief.
Okay.
Hi, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to hear you. I really appreciated your summary of the past century in trends in American Jewish education. And I'm wondering if you have any predictions for the next half century, for the next century.
Good question. That was one of the things we didn't get to.
Take your questions. Other questions?
Can I add to that one about education?
The issue that, an issue that really, my name is Shaya Kelter, and the issue that I'm most concerned about that you mentioned, especially Yitz, Rabbi Yitz mentioned, is the issue of intermarriage and assimilation, which I see as culturally, spiritually, culturally, and maritally. And according to my understanding, it's now easily over 80% of the non-Orthodox Jewish population in the United States. I think in Europe it's even higher than that. And the question, and it seems also, the other issue is, it seems that there doesn't seem to be too much urgency about this in the state of Israel. Very few people seem to care about it, not in the government, not in the population. And it seems like we're writing off the vast majority of the Jews of the United States. And my question is there anything that we can do as the Jewish people and as the state of Israel to help stem this massive hemorrhaging, which to me feels almost, I've heard other people use the term demographic holocaust, not in terms of death, but in terms of people just losing them.
Okay, so to try to combine the two questions in, so maybe the future of Jewish education, and is there something that Israel or Israelis or the Jewish people as a whole can do to combat intermarriage?
I'll just make, Yis is going to take both questions.
Oh, go ahead.
But I just make one comment. As I listen to Shai's assessment of the problem, things have changed now for me anyhow, and I think for a lot of Jewish people. Really the standing anti-Semitism and the slander of Israel actually looms much larger a problem than intermarriage for the future of Israel and the Jewish people. I wasn't aware until you asked the question how my understanding of what the core problem is, has changed in these last few years.
The famous Gemara is that prophecy ended with the rabbinic tradition, but it's left for children and fools to have the power of prophecy. So I think I'd qualify under the second category. So I would be, I was two very simple things. First of all, intermarriage, I would put it this way. I felt this about American Jewry 40 years ago, and it still exists. It's a race. It's a race between internal strengthening and development and enrichment. And again, I think Hadar is a very good example of the kind of cultural, religious enrichment that is needed on a mass, not just for leadership. When I started Klal, it was basically focused on community leadership, but Hadar is really saying that the average, not the average, the masses, the mainstream needs this exposure, and I agree. So the answer is, it's a race between upgrading. So the average Jew, the average layperson in an open society, has such a strong Jewish knowledge base, such a strong Jewish experiential life, that they choose to be Jewish in the face of a very attractive and open and a welcoming society. That is the challenge on the one hand, and there has been significant strengthening, but it's, I said it in the 60s, you see it clearer now. It's a race between this process and the process of open assimilation, acceptance, and disappearance. And of course, the answer is, it's a race. Now, be honest, in the 60s, I thought it'll be a race. At some point, the two curves will cross each other, and the future will be built out of the intensive group. The losses will stem as we lost a lot of people, and the internal group will be solid and grow slowly. I still think that's the most likely outcome. What I'm shocked to see and disappointed is that the two curves that cross not, as I'd hoped, in a much larger number on the internal side, but in a much larger number on the assimilation side. And of course, the intermarriage rate is a good example. Now, the other solution, of course, is what we see in Israel. In 1800, when the Jewish world decided to deal with modernity, there were two main responses. One was reshape Judaism in a form that can maintain itself in the open society and hold loyalty. The other was Zionism. Go to Israel and create a concentrated, you don't have an intermarriage problem in America and Israel because 80%, 90% of the 80% of the population is Jewish. Your neighbor next door is Jewish, and because of the Arab hostility and segregation, the truth is we have very low rates of intermarriage in this country. So the Zionist option, which was 4% of the Jewish people in 1800, is now 50 or 49.7% of the Jewish people at this point. So maybe the answer in part is that's, if you want to solve that problem, that's the way you got to get the Jews who are intermarrying or about to intermarry to live in Israel. The other choice, I say, unfinished, and in my judgment, long-term needed for everybody. So here's my projection for the future. I don't think it's simply projecting the present trends. The present trends, I say, are that the internal group is being strengthened. Blue mentions Steve's presence, Steve Laufer here, the Aviv Foundation. Classic example of the new philanthropy that understands that investing in Jewish content, Jewish learning, Jewish experience, particularly the modern Orthodox and the more committed Jews versions, and in Hadar and these broader committed versions. This is the key to the future. So if you project the trend, it's a smaller group. If you do what I'm about to do, I don't say it's determined by the simple trend. What it's determined by is the past record of the Jewish people. The reality has been that even after catastrophic falls, destruction, exile, assimilation in major ways, the Jewish people renewed itself. And just as physically after the Holocaust, it was a physical destruction, but the community renewed itself not only demographically by rebirth and renewal, but by religious renewal, by cultural renewal. 80% of the rabbis, Talmud scholars, Jewish learning, people alive in 1939, 30% of the Jews were killed of the world, but 80% of the rabbis, scholars, Talmud, Chacham, etc., were wiped out. But in response, the Jewish people came up with, today, more people learn Talmud full-time, more people are Talmudic scholars than ever before in Jewish history, far outstripping the numbers in the golden age of Europe and so on and so on. So my answer is based not on trends, but depend on the Jewish people. I think they will come through. And yes, the challenge of survival and of cultural renewal, religious experience is wide open, and it depends in part on you, the people in this room, and rooms like this around the world to take responsibility. But I'm Israel Chai. I have based on past history, I think one can depend on the Jewish people coming through. It won't happen by itself, but you'll have to take action. People listening will have to take action. But if we take action, I'm really an optimist that the future will be a renewal and a renaissance, maybe a renaissance worthy of any previous renaissance, and maybe greater than any Jewish history. It certainly will start with 50% more participation for women, so that's a big start right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Blue and Rav Yitz, for a wonderful evening we've really enjoyed. And now we're going to have Mariv.
I will add thank you. Thank you, Rav Yitz, thank you, Blue. תודה לכל מי שבא, תודה למשרד התפוצות, לעמי, שאפשרו לנו לעשות את המפגש המיוחד הזה בנושא הכל כך חשוב. כמו שידידה אמרה, תודה גם שהנחית את כל השיחה הזאת, אנחנו נתפלל מעריב בחוץ, למי שמעוניין, ממש עכשיו. אז אפשר לרדת מהמדרגות שכאן או מסביב.